Good morning, everyone, and warm welcome to this Partner DNV-GL's webinar. Today's topic is holistic supply chain assurance, and we are focusing on the future of supplier audit. I would like to say that it's great to see that so many of you are taking part of this webinar. I believe that we have around 100 people online. Hopefully you will enjoy this morning's session. And we are having an interesting agenda ahead today. Especially during these challenging times, the future of supplier audits raise questions, and we hope that this webinar will respond to some of them. Crisis situation can also be seen as an opportunity to rethink corporate responsibility. Though here in FIPS, our key message is that though we are facing difficult times, this is not the moment to stop developing your company's sustainability practices. This webinar will be facilitated by Paul McNeillis and Alberto Sartori, who both represent DNV-GL. In the end, we will have Q&A session, and again, I encourage you to send your questions through questions function. So without further ado, I welcome our speakers on the line. Welcome, Paul and Alberto.
Thank you, Mira. And
good morning, everyone.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here again, speaking to FIBS members. I've spoken on several occasions and met many of you. So for those of you who I haven't met yet, just a brief introduction. So my name is Paul McNeillis. I'm the Global Director of Assessment at DNV-GL. My background is over 20 years in sustainability in both consulting and software companies. And for many of those years, I've focused on sustainable supply chains. For example, setting up and running an online supplier qualification and risk management platform for the ICT industry. So my main interests are managing risks in supply chains, but also increasingly looking at how companies can advance from mastering those risks to creating value, and in particular through the use of digital technology. That's my background. Alberto?
I have been in DNV-GL for about 40 years, but in the audit industry for more than 15 years. My background is in social, ethical auditing, so I'm very much interested in the corporate social responsibility programs in organizations with specific experience in some sectors and plenty of audit experience with several standards.
Great, thanks, Alberto. So our message to you today is quite simple in a way. We're in extraordinary times with the current coronavirus crisis, and we see this as a time of obviously maximum risk, but also potentially a moment of opportunity for supply chain sustainability programs. And what we'd like to share with you today is some ideas and practices and experience that speak to that agenda and demonstrate, we believe, that whether or not this is a moment of risk to your sustainability program or a moment of opportunity will be largely determined by the extent to which you embrace a risk-based approach and the use of digital technologies. So it's pretty easy to understand the current disruption as a moment of risk. We have over 3.6 million cases of COVID-19 confirmed globally. Hundreds of countries have introduced travel restrictions, and global growth has halved. We have extensive unemployment claims, and of course, huge disruption to global supply chains. In this moment of challenge, we see that resilient supply chains are more important than ever. Whether it's the supply chains in food and beverage and retail, which are keeping society fed, or indeed the challenges that we still see persisting in terms of labor issues, human rights issues, and migrant worker issues. All of this is laid bare in real time more than ever during the coronavirus crisis. And we see something of a paradox here, that while some of these issues, such as labor rights, have been judged almost too complex to solve over many decades, we see that when our lives depend upon it, huge innovation is taking place within supply chains. So textile manufacturers are converting their operations to produce personal protective equipment, as are manufacturers producing ventilators. In the UK, Amazon is collaborating with government and testing laboratories to scale up testing efforts at a speed never seen before. So as we start to imagine what the new normal will look like, it increasingly feels like this new world of supply chains will be one where some supply chains are very much aligned with society's needs and expectations, and others are perhaps left behind. So even before the crisis, of course, supply chains were under pressure to deliver to the expectations of stakeholders around issues of trust. Traditionally, stakeholders like NGOs have been the conscience of society, often carrying out really in-depth examinations and investigations into conditions in supply chains for specific industries. If you were in one of those industries, you could expect significant reputational impacts if standards were found wanting. What has changed now in the digital age is that information is being shared increasingly rapidly, and there's an appetite from consumers for real transparency at the product level. This was demonstrated by a recent survey by Consumer Goods Forum, showing that consumers overwhelmingly wanted their information about ethical behavior in supply chains, not through a corporate report, but at source in the product. And there are increasingly a number of easily available apps in different industries which bring that transparency into the hands of the consumer. So for example, in the textile and fashion industry, there's an app called Good On You, which allows consumers of fashion to get an instant evaluation of their preferred brands in terms of the ethical and sustainable performance of their supply chains. Similarly, in the food space, an app called Yuka lays bare the attributes of food products. And the evaluations within these apps, for instance, Good On You, are not the usual sort of soft evaluations or certificates. They're really quite uncompromising, with phrases like "we avoid" for a particular brand or "not good enough." And if you're lucky, an evaluation of "it's a start." So at the same time, consumers are then offered other options with alternative products and brands. This is very different from the notion that we've had over many decades, where addressing these issues would be purely pre-competitive, quite a long-term shared responsibility. Now, it seems increasingly there will be winners and losers in terms of actually adopting and putting into practice the management of these risks. So the adoption of digital technology is important, but not sufficient alone. It needs to be embedded in a genuine risk-based approach to managing supply chain sustainability. And in our experience, we find that most companies don't take a genuine risk-based approach. They often have committed quite a lot of resources to a number of elements, such as supplier engagement, audit, and data reporting, but often they face persistent challenges. They're not able to really get a handle on all of the risk issues. Often, if they try to score suppliers, they're not really getting information into root cause. And typically, these approaches are quite static, not detecting emerging issues that might come out of left field. The focus tends to be on compliance rather than a feedback loop to create meaningful change. And although large amounts of data are gathered, companies struggle with actually getting insight into into what that data means. So what we see is that digital technology can bring a bright light to addressing many of these problems, as we're going to demonstrate. Just a word on a recent survey of FIBS companies. This was carried out between February and March of this year, just to confirm that many of the key elements of a risk-based approach are in place for companies. Basics like a code of conduct, training procurement functions in sustainability, and reaching out to tier 1 suppliers to look at their sustainability risks. However, there are significant and persistent gaps in areas such as reaching beyond Tier 1 into Tier 2 suppliers, supporting suppliers in their sustainable development, setting real KPIs, and assessing and communicating the sustainability performance of suppliers. These practices were the least implemented because they're the hardest to achieve, and we believe where digital technologies can add the most value in addressing these issues. Of course, at the same time, supply chains themselves are becoming more complex. There are a series of external drivers and internal drivers, which mean that the conventional linear supply chain of Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3 is actually becoming more like a complex ecosystem. And there could be additional risks and benefits within that scenario. The risks that getting a handle on data, insight, and information about risk in a more complex system is obviously going to be more challenging. But opportunities in that resilience could be increased by having more options within that wider supply chain. Of course, to master this complexity, digital technology becomes even more important. So what are some of the key elements? Well, we're bringing together a number of different elements. There is still a need for core physical audit and assurance elements, inspecting and assessing the organizations, products, people, processes, and facilities. And we don't see that going away anytime soon. But increasingly, this can be powerfully combined with digital assurance. Quite obviously, during these times of lockdown, having the ability to conduct remote audits, perhaps for particular low-risk suppliers, is something that can keep your risk management program viable and providing insight and data, and keep your suppliers engaged. Obviously, the need to collect and store data is enhanced by having a robust and scalable platform to do so. If you do want to reach beyond Tier 1, but in an increasingly complex environment, then being able to trust information as it moves through that complex path is very amenable to the application of technologies like blockchain. And of course, once this data is flowing in, you will need significant analytics to make sense of the trends, the risks, and monitor the effectiveness of your interventions. But finally, if you are able to, in terms of KPIs, introduce the concept of smart contracts, you may actually be able to not just set KPIs, but give them teeth with your suppliers. For example, setting a threshold below which your suppliers would not be able to continue to be an approved supplier if they fail to meet the KPI set. And that could be embedded through blockchain technology automatically in your systems. So we'd like to take a deep dive into some aspects, and perhaps the most pressing of these, given the constraints of the COVID pandemic, is the ability to travel, the need to keep audits going via remote audit techniques. And I'm going to hand over to Alberto to take us through some really practical examples of how that's achievable and cases where it's been achieved to great value. So Alberto, over to you.
Thank you, Paul. Let me share now my screen and continue with the presentation. Okay, now it should be set up. All right. As Paul has just introduced, on-site auditing can represent a challenge during these crisis times because of the lockdown of workplaces and factories, the restrictions to traveling, and all these limitations. So it has really risen up on the agenda of several companies and organizations, the opportunity of using digital technologies for remote assessment of suppliers in particular. So the topic of remote audits is very much discussed during this period. But remote audits were actually a new reality even before the current crisis. Experience has been built over the last years on this opportunity as a complement, particularly to on-site auditing. As Paul explained, physical on-site auditing is not going to disappear, but the new technologies are giving us new opportunities for some type of assessment activities, which of course are very much similar to what we are used to, but at the same time can bring also new benefits, new features, and new opportunities. And this is possibly the key message I would like to give today. Remote audits are not necessarily the short-term alternative to on-site auditing to manage the current crisis and get through it, and then at the end of the crisis we can go back to normal. It's actually having a new tool in our toolbox together and aside to other type of supplier assessment auditing activities, and more generally in our process for the qualification and approval of our suppliers. Some of the benefits connected to using digital technologies for this type of activities is in reducing the impact and the issues with traveling, the costs related to travel, the restrictions, of course, in accessing some factories, some hazardous environments, and similar. At the same time, there is a greater flexibility that the use of this technology allows. For example, the access to specific expertise can be more easily expanded because you can have access to expertise of basically from anywhere in the world without having to worry about the transportation moving from one country to another. As we are saying today, I am participating to this webinar. I'm sitting in Italy. Most of the audience here is in another country, in Finland, far away, but we can easily manage the same type of collaboration and participation. So this means having a new approach, what we can also consider a smarter approach to visiting facilities, performing assessment activities. At the same time, it is to be recognized that performing an activity from remote is not necessarily equivalent and equal to performing the activity on site. The same as doing this webinar is not the same as doing a physical meeting in person. So one of the main concerns in our industry as an audit company is to make sure that we develop a solution that our stakeholders can rely upon, fully aware of the constraints and limitations and the specific characteristics that this activity may have. So it should not be seen as necessarily the equivalent digital activity of an audit, but although there will be a lot of similarities, it should be regarded as a standalone activity, which can be performed on its own or can be integrated in a broader approach to supply chain assurance. So one of the key features for us in implementing this type of solutions is performing what we call the eligibility check or the suitability verification on each case to make sure that this type of approach, this methodology, fits for the purpose of the specific assessment. As Paul mentioned, this methodology may perfectly fit for some lower risk situations, for example. In other cases, for other industries, for some geographies, for some type of facilities, it may be more advisable to rely on other kind of activities, perhaps to stick to on-site auditing. So as DNV-GL, we have put in place a rigorous process to determine whether we should go ahead with remote auditing or we should advise our partners and clients to opt for other kind of solutions. Then having said that, and recognizing that remote auditing is not just the digitalization of previous physical audits, what are what is our recommended approach to make sure that we really implement a smart attitude to remote supplier auditing? First of all, of course, there is a fundamental requirement, which is the effective connectivity with the place to be audited. So if the facility, the supplier workplace needs to be assessed from remote, there needs to be some kind of data connection which is available. Having said that, this can be feasible even in remote locations. It is not necessarily something for more advanced countries or locations, because in the majority of cases, even a simple data connection, a mobile connection, can serve for the purpose. And also looking at the hardware required, most of the world is now connected with some kind of devices, either be a computer, a laptop, a tablet, or a smartphone. And in the majority of cases, this basic hardware will be enough. Even from a software point of view, for the majority of activities that we recommend in remote auditing, largely available tools and softwares will be enough, such as the program we are using today for this webinar, or other programs available for video conferencing. Then in case of specific issues or specific objectives from the remote audit, additional, more specific software solutions or even hardware solutions may be necessary, and that would be assessed on a case-by-case basis. One of the other constraints or characteristics of remote auditing is the availability of documentation in electronic formats. Any type of audit entails a review of a large set of documents and records. So if these records are available in electronic format or can be digitalized for the purpose of the audit, this is definitely to be looked at in order to assess whether the activity can be performed from remote or not. Not having the documents available in electronic format for us is a no-go. We could not accept to show paper records in front of a camera because of the issues of reliability and also of integrity that could be connected to this kind of problem. But in most of the situations we experience, companies are now have now digitalized their document set and their records. Only in a minority of cases, they would need to scan their paper records and transform it into a file. Actually, now many companies, especially in more industrialized countries and contexts, they also put their electronic files and records in a cloud, meaning that actually these documents can be accessed from remote, from anywhere, just by giving access to the cloud where these documents are stored. This is also a very effective solution to ensure for the reliability of the documents that are checked. So there is a lower risk identified with possible fake records if we can be granted access directly to the ERP, the management system, the cloud where these documents can be stored. One of the key points in our approach to remote auditing is preparation. As opposed to physical auditing, where preparation is recommended, but often users fail to properly prepare for the audit and still manage any barriers, any urgencies during the on-site audit. This can create specific additional issues in case of a remote audit. So preparation is fundamental for the effectiveness of this activity. That is why we recommend a different approach to the audit overall, spreading, where possible, the assessment activities over a longer period of time by eliminating the logistics considerations, the transportation, the moving from one site to another, from the auditor home to the factory and so on. This actually gives a bigger opportunity to apply smarter agendas, meaning that not all activities need to be performed on the same day. They can be actually split in a smarter plan through on a longer period, and this allows for anticipation of issues in advance, checking the necessary technical constraints, technological solutions that there may be to the effective auditing, take all the necessary precautions and safeguards in advance. And this makes the whole audit process actually more efficient and more risk-based, which is one of our other key messages. So this creates a funnel where we start getting some preparatory information in advance, ask for our audit documentation in advance to be reviewed, and then calibrate and focus the subsequent audit activities on those areas and items that are perceived as higher risk. All of this requires a mindset, an approach to remote auditing, as I said, which is not necessarily the digital equivalent of the traditional on-site auditing. It requires a different attitude, both from the auditor as well as from the auditee. So this is also a cultural change in the audit industry, let's say, and the way that audit programs can be implemented by integrated desk-based activities or documentary activities, remote activities, and on-site audits. If necessary, as I said, there may be a need for more advanced hardware or software solutions. One of the questions that are frequently raised when discussing about remote audits is the effectiveness of virtually visiting workplaces rather than by performing a site tour of the facilities. How can this be managed? Is it equally effective? How can you spot issues on site if you are not there? But also, how can you rely on a facility representative to guide the auditor around? Would the facility representative simply take you to their preferred locations and hide anything they would like the auditor not to see, or would the auditor be guided around without any possibility to lead the audit from this point of view? So for some activities like the virtual assessment or remote auditing or inspections of facilities, it may be advisable to use some advanced hardware and software solutions, which may not be necessary for auditing a different kind of workplace, or in case of low-risk sectors. So specific smart cameras or smart glasses, but also inspection-specific softwares. These kind of software are designed to work also with low bandwidth, to allow for a good quality image and streaming when performing site tours from remote. They are designed to work on any equipment such as a smartphone by downloading an app and allowing the telestration, the remote control by the auditor of the image taken by the camera on site. And to show you an example of some pictures taken during a recent remote audit at a production facility that we performed. I wished I could share with you a video, but I have used these pictures which were taken during the visit of this food processing company. And through the use of this specific software, we were able to take high resolution pictures, both in production areas, but across the entire site, including in the warehouse. As you can see, also in some areas with cluttered production, we were able to to use it in areas with low lighting, but also to focus on small prints. And we are able to detect issues if this can be a concern from stakeholders. We are able to detect issues in a way that gives confidence about the activity that has been performed. So when touring the warehouse, for example, identifying firefighting equipment not correctly placed around, and recording evidence directly during the remote audits of this non-conforming practice, and using this as evidence for our recording. Similarly, as we would do during an on-site audit. We are experiencing during this period, when the requests for remote audits has boomed compared to the past, that a reliable assessment of supplier practices and processes can still be done even through this methodology. And actually, this technology is giving additional opportunities, as I said, even beyond this current crisis. Of course, there is an opportunity for DNV-GL auditors to perform this activity off-site. So our auditors from offices or even from their own homes, they are able to perform their audit activities, including site visits from remote. Through, of course, the collaboration and the participation of an on-site representative with their own equipment. But there are additional opportunities that we can think of on a longer term basis. For example, having a DNV-GL auditor still on site, and in that case, the audit would be performed in the same way as would be traditionally with the physical presence of the auditor, but at the same time using the same approach and the same technology to have other stakeholders participating to the audit as observers or as fellow auditors, or simply as the client representative wishing to have a direct involvement and engagement in the supplier audit activities. In extreme cases, the technology can also be put at the disposal of other parties without the involvement of the DNV-GL for business-to-business relations between supplier and client, meaning that this could be used for internal audits or second-party audits, or for correcting non-conformities, for follow-up audits, and so on. So there is a wealth of solutions that the technology is making available to parties, as I said, to enrich the approach to supplier auditing. Having said that, our key message is also to look at supplier audits as one component of a more holistic approach to supplier qualification and approval. As Paul has been introducing, we strongly believe in a risk-based approach to the qualification of suppliers and the management of the supply chain sustainability performance and the risks deriving from non-compliances or other issues in general along the supply chain. Starting from a risk-based mapping of the supply chain. Investing in the visibility of the different tiers along the supply chain is a prerequisite for a more focused and efficient use of resources in any program for supply chain management. Then we also recognize as an audit company that auditing alone is not necessarily a solution to drive long-term improvement. Some issues are endemic. Some issues are systemic for specific industries, for specific countries, and they cannot necessarily be resolved with periodical audits alone, especially if suppliers, in a way, are left alone in managing their improvement and their compliance over time. Suppliers may lack the skills, may lack the resources, the competence, the knowledge, or access to other resources, external resources, in order to drive real improvement. And this creates a risk of duplicating audits, creating audit fatigue, investing several efforts on supplier auditing, but actually driving little real improvement and commercial value for the clients. So that is why we also propose to look at supplier auditing as one of the solutions to be integrated and complemented by additional activities of supplier engagement, capacity building, and going forward more increasingly on remediation programs. Remediation is particularly important. It does not limit to follow-up audits on non-compliances raised, is giving KPIs, as Paul explained, but is also designing a roadmap for suppliers on a longer-term basis on improvement expected, on establishing a partnership with suppliers that rewards positive behaviors. So is introducing again a more strategic approach to supply chain continuous improvement. And all of these activities generate a lot of data. Any program for managing the supply chain will generate a lot of performance indicators, and digital solutions are now available to collect this kind of data from all tiers of the supply chain, and Paul can introduce also some specific examples of this. However, companies are now increasingly overwhelmed with this kind of data, and several times and very often these data do not turn into something actionable, into something that company representatives in the buying organizations are able to use to steer their purchasing decisions or their quality or their sustainability decisions. So it is necessary to adopt solutions that can vary in terms of complexity, but starting also from more basic solutions to make this data actionable and make sure that any subsequent decision taken on this data is really informed about the results of the activities, the level of risk perceived or collected or measured along the supply chain, and so on. And finally, just sharing an example of a large company we have been working with in the food and beverage sector with a very complex supply chain, because it primarily includes suppliers of agricultural raw materials such as tea and coffee, which are very complex supply chains in terms of tiers, in terms of geographies, but also in terms of the issues connected with these supply chains. Human rights impacts are high in the agenda for companies in these sectors, with with systemic endemic issues in some countries, ranging from child labor to serious environmental impacts. Then the situation is made more complex by the fact that other categories are also included in the supply chain and other industries. So how do you build a systematic approach to ensure the overall sustainability of this supply chain? How do you manage the complexity of the different categories, of the different geographies? Even the coffee supply chain has very different features from one sourcing country such as Brazil to the smaller countries in Central America than Africa or India. So how do you ensure the consistency in approach, the effectiveness in reaching out to different tiers, and at the same time allow for the flexibility to manage the single situations in a customized way. So that is why we proposed and we worked with this large company on a risk-based approach that started from a comprehensive risk mapping of the supply chain, identifying the risk factors, the material issues specific for each single supply chain and single tier, and promoting and convincing this company to introduce a flexible and broader approach in terms of supply chain assessment, made up of supplier audits for sure, including on-site audits, but also documentary type of verification, desk-based assessments, remote assessments, and above all, to focus on performance improvement rather than compliance. So identification of expected objectives and target improvements rather than just setting a minimum compliance baseline. Okay, having said that, I am happy now to switch back to Paul for the remaining of the presentation.
Great, thanks, Alberto. So I think those were some very practical examples of remote audit and the value that it can bring. And I think you were particularly clear about this being a new tool in the box. And I hope people have grasped how valuable that tool can be. I just want to look at a couple of other tools in the box, which might be perceived as slightly more complex. Certainly when I've spoken about the Internet of Things and blockchain as technologies, a lot of companies have thought this is something maybe for later, maybe it's for large companies. So I wanted to give an example of how exploring the potential to improve performance and add value by applying these technologies has actually created value itself. The process of adopting technologies can drive performance improvement in itself. That's a key message I would like people to consider. So this was a seafood manufacturer, and they engaged us to look at the risks across their supply chain, which in fact was a cold chain. So they're sourcing fresh fish and they're delivering a fresh sushi product to their consumers. And they wanted to do several things. They wanted to examine the efficiency and effectiveness of that cold chain, getting more data by applying Internet of Things sensors into the weak spots. So we brought together our ability to audit, inspect and identify the key risks. We then deployed technologies such as sensors, temperature sensors in key weak spots, such as the logistics area, to guarantee that cold temperatures were maintained throughout the life cycle. Then, as the product was delivered to the consumer, that information and data generated through Internet of Things was locked into a secure blockchain and released at the point of consumption for the consumer on the shelf through a QR code. So you can see that there were several outcomes and benefits to this. This company was able to manage the risks within their supply chain, identify those, to gain insights into the efficiency of their overall process and drive performance improvement, and also to add value to their product at the point of consumption, simply by embracing all of these different technologies. Sometimes the solutions can be even simpler. This is our technology which leverages our ability to help companies tell an authentic, verified story about their supply chain and their product. We applied this to the wine industry in a number of different geographies, and we inspected their supply chains with regards to labor rights, sustainability issues, environmental impact, captured that information securely on a blockchain, and again, enabled it to be released through a QR code on the product to the consumers. This is something that when I first spoke about it to a small group, I think it was the Finnish Textiles Associations a year ago, was at quite an early pilot stage. I'm happy to say that this technology, together with the other technologies that we've mentioned, are now at industrial scale. They can be deployed efficiently, effectively, and quite cheaply to add value to your products. So, I mean, I started out by saying that this is a time of maximum risk and maximum opportunity for your sustainable supply chain programs and your supplier qualification programs. There are things that we've demonstrated you need to do. And out of that necessity, you'll find access to new tools, such as the tools that Alberto presented and gave cases of around remote audit. Our case is that now is the time to really embrace these technologies, the use of blockchain, the use of QR codes, sensors, and platforms and analytics to analyze your data in order to be more resilient, more performant, reduce risk, and really add value to your propositions, products, and supply chains for your business. So I hope you've enjoyed the presentation. That concludes the presentation, and we wish you well in the improvement of your supply chain programs and the application of digital technology. We're very happy to take your initial questions now, and in future, if you'd like to get in touch with us and explore the potential of any of these technologies to your specific business, of course, we'd be delighted to have that conversation and explore with you.
Thank you very much, Paul and Alberto. We have received a couple of questions, and let me see. The first one is, what digital solutions are available to have a remote follow-up to understand if corrective actions from audits have been implemented?
Okay. The digital solutions available for remote auditing in general are different. As I said, we can use more broadly available tools and softwares for video conference or collaborative platforms, and these are preferred solutions for the majority of cases because they are available to all parties. So they don't require downloading or application of new softwares or apps and so on. However, if virtual assessment of workplaces, of facilities is necessary, then we would propose a specific dedicated software. So there is no straight answer to that. It would require an evaluation case by case, depending on the type of issue that needs to be verified, and similarly the same answer would apply for the type of audit. So depending on the kind of criteria to be assessed, is this a social audit checking on working conditions and human rights? Is it a food safety audit, or is it some other kind of supplier audit?
Okay, thank you. Then another question is, when preparing to audits, do you also use third-party data sources to gather information pre-hand? And if so, what information would be valuable?
Sure. Any kind of information that can be reviewed and used in advance is very much welcome, especially in case of remote audit activities. Again, there is no standard process here because this can be quite a time-consuming activity. So depending on the specifics of the audits, we may have more or less time available for preparation. In case of a sustainability audit, for example, there are a number of third-party platforms available, but some of these are also protected, meaning that the data information is not available to all stakeholders. So if there is a compliance information on a specific auditee, not necessarily we would have visibility on that. So this requires perhaps a collaboration from the supplier itself in terms of disclosure or collaboration from the client requesting an audit on the supplier to share previously available information.
And then there is also a question regarding what kind of digital platform DNV-GL is using to perform remote audits.
As I said, in many cases, we use programs such as Teams or Zoom or Skype or similar, because these are available globally. Facilities around the world are familiar now and even more increasingly with the use of these collaborative platforms and tools. If they serve for the purpose, we have our preferred solutions because of the different features of each one of them and the information security features connected to each platform. So we have our preferred solutions, but we don't mandate a proprietary solution from DNV-GL for the audit, just for the ease and the efficiency of the overall process. So we rely on existing platforms and also on the audit own platform if available, because this is making the process easier. For assessing virtually the facilities from remote, we have a licensed software, as I said, which is specific for inspection activities. But even in this case, we take care of all the software aspects. So we provide the application to be installed at the client side. All they have to do is to follow our instructions, and there are no additional costs associated or specific hardware to be purchased.
Okay, thank you. And are you able to fully qualify a new potential supplier only by remote assessment?
This is a question which has been which comes often, which is often proposed. Some stakeholders believe that this methodology should be applied only to so-called periodical audits or re-audits after a facility, after a supplier has already been visited in the past physically. Others consider that this same methodology could also be applied in case of new facilities which are seen for the first time. Our approach is that this should be a risk-based information, that we don't have a criteria of this kind when performing our eligibility process. So we review each audit on a case-by-case basis, depending on the audit criteria, on the type of facility, on the history of this facility, of previous non-conformances, for example, any risk which is identified with that audit, and this also takes into account the fact whether we have visited it before, but not only, because the opposite is also true. We may have a facility which has been visited in the past, even by DNV-GL, but we still consider too risky to perform a remote assessment from there because of the inherent limitations or constraints with using the remote technology. So to answer the question in short words, yes, we believe it can be applied to even new facilities to be qualified and approved, but that will still have to be reviewed on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, and what scope or level of document can be considered as accessible for the remote audit?
Again, this would depend on the type of audit, but normally records, we normally separate records into kinds. Records with company-related information, and we don't see specific limitations in sharing these documents electronically from remote. The same type of confidentiality and information security measures would apply for physical and remote activity. Different consideration is under discussion for records containing personal data, such as employment contracts, payrolls, and so on. Because of the GDPR laws, we need to be extremely careful in making sure that we comply with applicable privacy laws, and also that we maintain the confidence in the auditee on the proper use of these the records and the archiving and the management of this information. So even where it may be compliant to privacy laws and regulations, we may still take extra precautions for the sharing of records with personal data. Still, we are performing remote audits that focus on labor conditions where these documents are shared in protected form. So this is not a barrier to performing the audit, but simply a need to manage this type of records in a different way.
Okay, thank you very much. And how to manage the additive policy when auditing the shop floor? Because in many cases, it's not allowed to take pictures or videos in this area. That was the next one.
Clearly, this can be a huge barrier to perform the remote audit. There are some places where even the visit from an external visitor is not allowed. So in that case, even the on-site audit would not be possible. But for sure, if the remote audit has to take place, we need to be given access through live streaming with a camera, with the possibility for the lead auditor from remote to set the pace of the tour to determine which areas need to be reviewed and so on. If these conditions are not met, cannot be met from the side of the auditee, then we would consider that the audit cannot be performed. Overall, the remote audit, as for any other kind of audit, needs the collaboration, the transparency, the commitment from the auditee. If these elements are not in place, then any audit is due to fail or not to take place at all.
Now I think that we have time for one final question, and that would be what investments can be required by suppliers to perform remote audits in general? What is the feedback on that so far?
I would say that investment is not necessary in terms of equipment, such as hardware and software, because, as I said, basic tools would serve, or the audit firm would take care if additional features are needed. Investment is needed in terms of preparation. The facility should commit to familiarize with the necessary activities, with the preparation that needs to be done. With the availability of the people and the company representatives to support this process before and during the remote audit. And then an investment may be necessary in some cases in terms of availability of electronic documentation. If records are already available in digital format, then the investment from this point of view can be minimal. On the contrary, if a company is relying on paper records, then there could be a significant investment in making all these records digital by scanning all the papers and the pages to provide to the auditor. And this could be something to be taken into account.
Thank you, Alberto. And once again, Paul and Alberto, thank you for a very practical presentation and taking part of this webinar. And thank you all for participating in. This recording of the webinar will be available by tomorrow. But as I told you earlier, unfortunately, the slides and presentations won't be shared. Have a great week. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.